The introduction this time isn't exactly a specific set of instructions. Very loose, in fact. To start, the description basically for a gnome, the entity, creature, spirit, however you want to define what a gnome is that we're talking about. Speaking of definitions, Wikipedia says that a gnome is a diminutive spirit in Renaissance magic and alchemy, first introduced by Paracelsus in the 16th century and later adopted by more recent authors, including those of modern fantasy literature. Its characteristics have been reinterpreted to suit the needs of various storytellers, but it is typically said to be a small, humanoid creature that lives underground. Now, the Wikipedia goes on to mention the origins of the word and where they theorize it came from, but basically the first mention of it is out of the 16th century from the Swiss alchemist Paracelsus. Beyond that, the Wikipedia basically just mentions some of the more modern fairy tales, stuff after the 18th century. And then, of course, the mention of things like gnomes in fiction and fantasy, obvious fantasy stuff like Chronicles of Narnia or Oz, Harry Potter, for example. Now, the idea here didn't come exactly from the Wikipedia. It came from some peers, and one in mind, Dan Martin, who, after discussing this a little bit in the comments, sent me some information he had on some ideas that would help sort of flesh out how I would do a ritual that would involve trying to get the attention of a gnome, more or less. Some of the information he sent me was loosely in reference to other parts of the ritual itself, things on amulets and talismans, things on candle burning, in particular how green candles represent marriage, relationships, balance, practical creativity, particularly with the hands, fertility, growth, attracting good luck, improving finances, and then beings such as elves, gnomes, brownies, and fairies. This isn't all information from the same book, but it's from two of the books, for example, that you've seen here. G.J. Conway's book, Magical, Mystical Creatures Invite Their Powers into Your Life, who has sold quite a few books on things such as Celtic magic, 227,000 copies according to Amazon's description of the Magical Mystical Creatures book. Anyway, back to the information. The other book some of the information came from was Buckland's complete book of Witchcraft by Raymond Buckland. Of course, you can see the author's name there, to give credit where it's due. And some of the information from that was in reference to dancing and ritual chanting. Back to the gnomes, though. Back to the good part. Gnomes are elemental beings, according to the book here from D.J. Conway. Gnomes are elemental beings who are closely tied to the earth. The word gnome came from the Greek genomus, which means earth dweller, or noma, which means the knowing ones. The term gnome has come to include many species of earth elementals besides the creatures that we know by this name. The Germans call these little beings Erdmanlings. I'm going to screw up some of these other languages' names for gnomes, just so you're aware of that in advance. While in the German Alpine areas, they are known as Heinzmannchens. The Swedes know them as Nissen, a name similar to Nissi, which is used by the Danes and Norwegians. The Balkan countries have several names: Gnome, Jude, Mano. Gnomes themselves as a species are of a wide variety of types and forms. Most of them range from 4 to 12 inches in height. They take on the physical appearance of the people of the country and culture in which they live, and have been seen all around the world. The older males grow beards, while it is traditional for the married females to wear a scarf. Most gnomes weave cloth for clothing, sewing it into peasant costumes. Some of them wear clothing made from the plants near where they live, while others appear to quote-unquote grow their garments like the fur of animals. The males usually wear pointed red hats, multicolored stockings or tight leg coverings, and a jerkin or tunic. The females wear headscarves, blouses, long skirts, aprons, and multicolored stockings. Gnomes can live for several hundred years. They marry and have families. Small children of a quiet disposition often see and communicate with gnomes, while this is more difficult for adults who question everything. Most gnomes are prepared to earn their food by diligent work. Their usual foods are cereals and root vegetables, but for special festive occasions they do brew ale. Ordinarily, they are good-humored beings, helpful and benign to humans and all other creatures. However, if humans destroy their habitat with reckless regard, they have been known to sabotage projects and cause great damage. Gnomes prefer to build underground colonies in dim forests, or the root systems of large trees. They are adaptable, though, and will build homes in rock gardens, empty bird houses, thick shrubbery, or other out-of-the-way places in civilization. They often have several secret hiding places where they can store things. I want to step back here a second. That it mentions that basically if you tried to do something negative to get the attention of a gnome, that would only result in the gnome sabotaging something in your life. In other words, if we're using this as a factual representation of what a gnome is, trying to piss a gnome off or trying to do a negative approach, something similar to where I've taunted paranormal entities, would only result in bad luck, which would be unmeasurable or impossible to accurately attribute to a gnome in any way other than pure speculation. So, for the sake of argument, the positive approach here is the only logical approach. To continue now, gnomes are not fond of technology, preferring to work at their weaving and woodworking or helping the plants and animals that share their environment. Since they have great insight into actions of universal energy, they can influence animate and inanimate creatures and objects. To raise magical energy, the gnomes like to dance. Gnomes have an innate ability to learn from the past and predict the future. They also have great understanding of the energy patterns around all things, making it possible for them to influence and heal. Seldom are gnomes malicious or troublesome. A very similar being in Denmark and Sweden is called the Nisse Godring, which means Nisse good lad, and in Sweden the Tomtgub, or which means old man of the house. They say the Nisse is about the size of a year-old child, but looks like an old man dressed in gray with a pointed red cap. They say nothing goes well unless a Nisse lives in the house or on the farm. The Norwegian Nisse love the moonlight and, during the winter, often frolic in the snow at night. They are highly skilled in fiddling, music, and dance. Nisse who live in churches are called the Kirkgrim. And then there's a small add-on at the bottom that explains some of their psychological attributes, such as a happy person who likes to aid animals, one close to the earth, and the old gods, especially the goddess. And the magical attributes are good luck, fiddle playing, music, dance, divination, raising magical energy, and help for plants or animals. Now, with some discussion, the basic idea we came up with was a short mix of some of these things, but when I actually got there to do what comes natural, I tried a few different things. And the first part, which you're not going to get to see, of me doing it all naked, for the most natural approach, was only slightly different, but the second part is me clothed, of course, and much very similar representation. So without more explanation, you've gotten the basic idea. Dance for raising power, and we also agreed that as for a talisman, a type of offering to the gnome, I would use the adder stone that you might have seen mentioned in an earlier video. I might link that on the screen here or in the description below. Basically, making an offering and performing a type of ritual that involves some amount of rhythm and rhyming chant with green candles lit in a location that is close to nature, and it might not be very clear from the phrase I use for the chant what exactly the goal is, but basically it's the same idea as the myth behind the Adderstone, that the Adderstone can allow you to see things that are supernatural or paranormal in essence. Look beyond the glamour, as some call it, beyond whatever kind of magic, or to put it in a more scientific phrasing, imagine there was a certain, well, take the camcorder for example. Seeing infrared light. Think of it that way. Imagine if the Adderstone, when looking through it, allowed you to see things in a different part of the light spectrum than the typical visible light spectrum. So with that being said, I'm basically asking for that ability, which the Adderstone is supposed to grant, but I've had no success attempting to use the Adderstone to see supernatural or paranormal entities. So I'm offering it up in this ritual to gain that ability, and I'm asking the gnome to be the one to accept that offer. And of course there's the dance and the song, blah blah blah, the rhythm basically, no song, candles, etc. You get the idea. Just take a look. And just for reference, as I'm recording this after I actually did the ritual, I still haven't actually checked if the Adderstone is gone. I'll be checking that tomorrow, which I will assume if it is, means that the offer was accepted. But I haven't seen anything yet. Weekly update will be more of a conclusive update on whether or not I've noticed anything. But until then, check this out.
For Adderstone and candles bright, I ask you, Gnome, to grant me sight. For Adderstone and candles bright, I ask you, Gnome, to grant me sight. For Adderstone and candles bright, I ask you, Gnome, to grant me sight. For Adderstone and candles bright, I ask you, Gnome, to grant me sight. Adderstone and candles bright, I ask you, Gnome, to grant me sight. Something I noticed I thought was really cool, I wanted to show you guys. I think, not certain, but I think these are the leftovers from some turtle eggs. Isn't that cool? And something else. Look at her. Isn't she cool? Candles bright, ask you, Gnome, to grant me sight. I don't want to disturb her too much, but you can kind of see her in there. I know it's upside down, but if you look close, she's guarding her eggs.